The day my mother-in-law called me a disgrace in front of my children wasn't the day my life fell apart. By then, most of it already had. The wheelchair beneath me was only the part everyone could see. What they couldn't see was the quiet grief of waking up every morning hoping my husband would look at me the way he used to, only to watch his eyes slide away before they ever met mine. They couldn't see how hard I smiled for my children so they would never think their mother had given up. And they definitely couldn't see that the woman humiliating me that afternoon had already stolen far more than my ability to walk. My name is Madeline Foster. I'm 29 years old, and if you'd met me before the accident, you probably would have described me as the dependable one. I worked as an occupational therapist, helping people rebuild their lives after injuries and illnesses. It was ironic in a way I would only understand later. Every day I encouraged strangers not to lose hope when their bodies betrayed them. I just never imagined I'd be the one sitting on the other side of that conversation. My husband, Daniel Hale, liked to joke that I spent more time worrying about other people than I did about myself. Back then I thought it was a compliment. Looking back now, I realize it was also true. My world revolved around Daniel and our two children, Emma, who had just turned 10, and Noah, our energetic 6-year-old who believed every scraped knee could be fixed with a hug from his mom. They were the center of my universe. If someone had asked me then what success looked like, I wouldn't have talked about money or promotions. I would have pointed to our little dinner table, where Emma always tried to beat her brother to telling me about her day, where Noah somehow managed to spill his milk at least twice a week, and where Daniel laughed just enough to make our ordinary evenings feel special. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. There was only one shadow hanging over that happiness, and her name was Veronica Hale. My mother-in-law had mastered the art of sounding polite while making you feel like you didn't belong. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Every compliment came wrapped around an insult. Every smile reminded me I was still being evaluated. "You make a lovely meal," she'd say before adding. Daniel always preferred the way I seasoned the roast. Or she'd pat my shoulder and whisper, "You're doing your best, that's what matters." Somehow hearing those words always made me feel like my best wasn't enough. Daniel usually brushed it off. "That's just Mom," he'd tell me with a tired smile. "She doesn't mean anything by it." I wanted to believe him because believing him was easier than admitting my husband's loyalty had invisible conditions attached to it. Veronica had been a widow for nearly 15 years. Daniel was her only child, and she treated him less like a grown man and more like something she still owned. She called him every morning before work, every evening before dinner, and showed up at our house without warning at least twice a week. I told myself she was lonely. I told myself family required patience. I told myself that one day she'd finally see I loved her son as much as she did. I spent years chasing an approval that kept moving farther away every time I reached for it. The morning everything changed started like dozens of others. Emma had forgotten her science project by the front door. Noah insisted he couldn't find his favorite sneakers, even though they were sitting right beside the couch. Daniel kissed me quickly before leaving for work and said, "Try not to work too late tonight." I smiled and answered, "Only if you promise not to let your mom convince you to skip dinner with us again." He laughed awkwardly instead of answering. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Around 4 that afternoon, I finished seeing my last patient and headed home. It had rained earlier, leaving the roads damp but clear. I remember turning up the radio because an old song Emma loved came on. I remember thinking about what we'd have for dinner. I remember stopping at a green light before continuing through the intersection. Then I remember pressing my brake pedal and feeling nothing, no resistance, no slowing. Just the sickening realization that my car wasn't responding the way it should. Everything after that happened too fast for my mind to catch up. I pulled on the emergency brake instinctively. I tried steering away from another vehicle. Tires screamed. Metal slammed against metal. The world spun sideways before dissolving into darkness. When I opened my eyes again, white ceiling tiles replaced the gray sky I'd last seen. Machines beeped steadily beside me. My mouth felt dry, and every breath seemed borrowed from someone else. A doctor noticed I was awake and gently introduced himself before explaining that I'd undergone emergency surgery. My spine had been badly injured. There would be months of rehabilitation, maybe years, He paused before saying the sentence that divided my life into before and after. We don't know yet how much mobility you'll regain. I didn't ask about myself first. I asked about my children. He smiled softly. They weren't with you? They're safe. Only then did I cry. Daniel visited every day during that first week. He held my hand. He brought Emma's drawings and Noah's messy, handwritten notes that always ended with the same sentence, "We love you, Mommy." Veronica came to, though her visits felt different. She stood at the foot of my bed instead of beside it. She looked at the machines more than she looked at me. One afternoon, she sighed quietly and said, "This must be so difficult for Daniel." I waited for her to ask how I was feeling. She never did. As the weeks passed, the rhythm changed. Daniel's visits became shorter. Work kept him busy, he said. Veronica began answering questions before he could. "He's exhausted," she'd explain. "This has been so hard on him." Listening to her, you'd think my husband was the patient. Physical therapy started before I even left the hospital. The first time they helped me sit upright, sweat rolled down my face from the effort alone. Every tiny movement felt like climbing a mountain barefoot. One afternoon, after managing to stand for less than 10 seconds with parallel bars supporting most of my weight, I burst into tears. My therapist crouched beside me and said, "Don't measure your progress against who you were. Measure it against yesterday." I repeated those words to myself every night afterward. I needed something to believe in because hope was becoming harder to find at home. When I was finally discharged, our house looked almost the same, but nothing inside it felt familiar anymore. Daniel had arranged for a temporary wheelchair ramp. Emma decorated my bedroom with handmade paper flowers. Noah proudly announced he had learned how to carry laundry baskets, like a grown-up. Their love kept me breathing. Everyone else's silence slowly suffocated me. Veronica started coming over almost every afternoon. At first she brought soup or groceries. Soon she brought opinions. She criticized how I folded laundry from my chair. She questioned whether I should still help Emma with homework. She even suggested Noah spend more weekends with her, so he wouldn't have to see his mother struggle all the time. Daniel rarely disagreed. Sometimes he'd simply stare into his coffee until the conversation ended. Other times he'd quietly leave the room altogether. I told myself he was overwhelmed. I told myself grief affected everyone differently. But excuses become heavier every day you carry them. About 3 months after the accident, I woke before sunrise and couldn't find Daniel beside me. Assuming he'd fallen asleep on the couch again, I wheeled myself slowly down the hallway. Before I reached the living room, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Veronica's voice was calm, almost comforting. "Daniel, this isn't a life. You're too young to spend the next 30 years taking care of someone who may never recover." My hands tightened around the wheels. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The silence lasted just long enough to break something inside me. Then he whispered, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore." I couldn't hear the rest because my heartbeat had become louder than their conversation. I turned my wheelchair around as quietly as I could and returned to my bedroom before either of them realized I'd been there. For the first time since the accident, I wasn't afraid of whether I'd ever walk again. I was afraid that my marriage had already stopped standing long before my legs did. And somehow, I knew the worst was still waiting for me. By the time I came home from the hospital, Veronica had already started acting like my recovery was a temporary inconvenience that needed a permanent solution. She never said it that plainly at first. She was too careful for that. Instead, she rearranged my kitchen without asking because, according to her, Daniel shouldn't have to reach around your equipment just to make coffee. She moved Noah's art supplies out of the living room because she said the room looked cluttered with my wheelchair there too. She told Emma not to ask me for help with her school project because I needed rest, even though helping my daughter was one of the few things that still made me feel like myself. Every small decision became another way of shrinking my place inside my own home. Daniel saw it happening. I know he did. Sometimes I caught him watching his mother with a tense jaw, as if a protest had reached his throat and died there. But he never said enough. The first real argument came after Veronica suggested moving our bedroom downstairs permanently and turning the upstairs room into Daniel's private space. I laughed once because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "He needs somewhere normal to sleep," she said, standing beside my chair like she was discussing furniture, not my marriage. Daniel rubbed his forehead and murmured, "Mom, maybe not right now." "Not no. Not that's my wife. Not don't speak about her like that. Just maybe not right now." I looked at him, waiting for more, and when nothing came, I felt something inside me go still. Emma noticed before anyone else did. Children always notice the things adults pretend are invisible. She started staying closer to me, bringing her homework to the table beside my chair, offering to refill my water even when the glass was still full. One night, while I was helping her with fractions, she suddenly asked, "Grandma doesn't think you're going to get better, does she?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to give her the kind of answer children deserve. Instead, I touched her hand and said, "Grandma doesn't get to decide that." Emma nodded, but her eyes stayed too serious for a 10-year-old. Noah reacted differently. He tried to make everything into a game. He would race down the hallway and shout, "Mommy, watch me run for both of us!" Then he would climb into my lap carefully, as if afraid of breaking me. I smiled every time because he needed to see that he could still make me happy. But at night, after both kids were asleep, I sometimes pressed my face into a pillow and cried as quietly as possible so no one would hear. Physical therapy became the only place where people spoke to me like my future still existed. My therapist, Karen, was firm but kind. She didn't pity me, and I loved her for that. She made me work until my arms shook, until my back ached, until sweat dampened my shirt and frustration burned behind my eyes. One afternoon, after weeks of failing, I pushed myself upright between the parallel bars and held my weight for almost 12 seconds. 12 seconds. Before the accident, I could have walked across a parking lot while carrying Noah and 3 grocery bags without thinking about it. But that day, 12 seconds felt like a miracle. I couldn't wait to tell Daniel. When he came home, Veronica was with him. She had brought dinner in containers from a restaurant Daniel loved. I told them the news before they even sat down. "I stood today," I said, smiling despite how nervous I felt. "Only for a few seconds, but Karen said it was real progress." Daniel looked up, and for one brief moment, I saw the man I had married. "That's great, Maddie." Then Veronica set a container on the counter a little too hard. "Let's not get everyone's hopes up over 12 seconds. The room went silent. Emma stared at her grandmother. Daniel looked down. I waited again. I always seemed to be waiting then. Finally, I said, "Was important to me." Veronica gave me a soft, practiced smile. Of course it was. I just think Daniel needs realistic expectations. That was the first time I understood she wasn't only trying to convince Daniel that I was a burden. She was trying to convince me, too. A week later, I found out she had invited Daniel's old girlfriend, Celeste, to a charity dinner where Daniel would be speaking for his company. I didn't discover it because anyone told me. I saw Celeste's name flash across Daniel's phone while it sat on the kitchen table. The message preview said, "Your mom said you might need a friendly face there." I stared at it until the screen went dark. Celeste came from the kind of family Veronica respected. Polished, wealthy, connected. She had dated Daniel briefly before he met me, and Veronica had never forgiven me for not being her. When Daniel walked in, I asked, "Why is Celeste texting you?" His face changed immediately. Not guilt exactly, something weaker, something worse. Mom invited her to the dinner. I didn't know until today. "Hundy, you didn't think to tell me." He sighed like I was making something harder than it needed to be. "Madeline, it's just a dinner. You're not exactly able to go right now." The words hit harder because he didn't sound cruel. He sounded tired, as if my pain had become an administrative problem he no longer wanted to manage. I said, "I am still your wife." He looked at me then, really looked, and for half a second I thought he would apologize. Instead, he said, "I know." But knowing had stopped meaning anything. Veronica arrived the next afternoon with a bouquet of white lilies and a smile sharp enough to cut skin. She placed the flowers on the dining table and told me Daniel had done wonderfully at the dinner. She mentioned Celeste 3 times in 5 minutes. How elegant she looked. How easily she moved through the room. How naturally she fit beside Daniel when people gathered for photos. I sat in my wheelchair with my hands folded in my lap and let her talk. If I reacted, she would win the scene she had come to perform. So I gave her nothing. That made her angrier than yelling would have. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You should love him enough to let him have a life." I answered quietly, "My children, and I are his life." Her smile disappeared. For the first time, I saw the woman beneath the polish. Cold, impatient, almost offended that I still believed I had a claim to my own family. That evening Daniel didn't come home until after midnight. He said he had been working late. I didn't ask if that was true. I didn't have the energy to hear another half answer. The next morning, Veronica called while we were having breakfast and asked him to come by her house before work. He left without finishing his coffee. Emma watched him go, then looked at me and asked, "Is Daddy mad at us?" I reached for her, but she stepped away before I could touch her hand. That broke me more than Daniel's silence ever could. Because now my children weren't just witnessing the fracture, they were starting to think they had caused it. By the end of that week, Veronica stopped pretending. She told Daniel the house was becoming emotionally unhealthy. She told him Emma was too attached to me. She said no needed routine away from medical equipment and sadness. Then she suggested the children spend more nights at her place. For stability. Daniel brought it up like it was reasonable. He sat across from me, unable to meet my eyes, and said, "Maybe just for a little while, until things feel calmer." I stared at him. "You want to send my children away because your mother thinks my wheelchair makes the house sad." He flinched. "That's not what I said." "No," I said. "That's what you let her say for you." He stood up then, angry because the truth had cornered him. "You don't know how hard this is." I almost laughed. I almost asked him whether he meant watching me suffer or being expected to love me through it. But Noah was in the next room, humming to himself while coloring, and Emma was pretending not to listen from the stairs. So I swallowed the words. Veronica came over that Sunday wearing pearls and carrying a folder. The folder scared me more than her expression did. People don't bring folders to family visits unless they have already decided something. She placed it on the coffee table and sat across from me while Daniel stood near the fireplace like a man waiting for instructions. "We need to talk," she said. "As a family." Emma appeared at the bottom of the stairs with Noah behind her, his small hand gripping her sleeve. Veronica looked at them, then back at me, and smiled like she had chosen her audience carefully. I felt the air change. I felt the room tighten around me. And before she opened that folder, before she said the words that would push me out of my own life, I already knew Daniel was not going to save me. I have replayed that Sunday in my mind more times than I can count, and no matter how many years pass, I still remember the sound before I remember the words. It was the sound of Veronica opening that thick folder and placing several neatly organized documents on my coffee table as though she were conducting a business meeting instead of dismantling a family. Emma instinctively stepped closer to my wheelchair. Noah climbed onto the couch beside me, clutching the stuffed dinosaur he carried everywhere. Daniel remained standing, his hands shoved into his pockets, staring at the floor as if avoiding my eyes would somehow make the next few minutes less real. Veronica folded her hands and smiled with practiced sympathy. "Madeline," she began softly, "we're all worried about you." I didn't answer. I had learned that whenever she started a sentence with concern, cruelty usually followed. She continued, "The children have been through so much. Daniel has been under unbearable pressure. We all have." She paused long enough to let the silence work in her favor before adding, "Sometimes loving someone means knowing when to let them go." My stomach tightened. "What exactly are you saying?" I asked. She slid one of the papers toward me. It wasn't divorce paperwork, at least not yet. It was information about long-term rehabilitation facilities and assisted living communities that specialized in patients with spinal injuries. "These places are wonderful," she said. "You'll receive professional care around the clock. The children can visit you every weekend." For a second, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood her. "You want to send me away?" Veronica tilted her head. "We're trying to do what's best for everyone." I looked directly at Daniel. "Did you know about this?" His silence answered before his mouth did. Finally, he whispered, "Mom thought we should discuss all the options." All the options. As though I were discussing a change of schools instead of being removed from my own home. Emma suddenly stood between my wheelchair and Veronica. "My mom isn't going anywhere," she said, her voice shaking but determined. Veronica forced another smile. "Sweetheart, the adults are talking." Emma didn't move. "You're being mean." I had never been prouder of my daughter. Veronica's expression hardened for just a moment before she recovered. "Daniel," she said calmly, "perhaps you should take the children upstairs." No grabbed my arm. "I'm staying with Mommy." Daniel took one hesitant step toward us but stopped when I looked at him. "No," I said quietly. If decisions about my life are being made in front of my children, then they deserve to hear every word. Veronica sighed dramatically, almost as though I were being unreasonable. Then she finally dropped the mask. She turned toward me, her voice growing colder with every sentence. The truth is that this family cannot move forward while everyone is expected to revolve around your condition. Daniel deserves a wife, not a patient. Emma and Noah deserve a normal childhood. And frankly, she looked me up and down before finishing, a woman who cannot even stand on her own has become a disgrace to this family. Emma gasped. Noah burst into tears. The room became painfully quiet except for his sobbing. I stared at Veronica, waiting for Daniel to say something. Anything. I wasn't expecting a speech, just one sentence. One simple sentence telling his mother she had crossed a line. Instead, he looked away. My heart didn't break in that moment. It simply stopped expecting anything from him ever again. I wiped Noah's tears with the sleeve of my sweater before speaking. "Ma?" I said gently. "Would you help your brother pack a few clothes?" Both children looked confused. "Why?" Emma whispered. I smiled through tears I refused to let fall. "'Cause we're leaving." Daniel finally looked up. "Madeline, don't do this." I met his eyes for the first time all afternoon. "I'm not the one doing this." Veronica opened her mouth to object, but I raised my hand. "Don't worry," I said. "You'll get exactly what you wanted. You won't have to look at the disgrace anymore." I rolled toward our bedroom while Emma quietly led Noah behind me. Every push on the wheels felt heavier than the last. Inside the bedroom, I opened the closet and began taking out only what mattered: clothes, birth certificates, passports, medical records, the children's favorite books. I ignored the wedding album sitting on the shelf. I ignored every expensive piece of furniture. I ignored the framed photographs from happier years because none of those memories belonged to me anymore. Emma folded clothes carefully into 2 duffel bags while Noah sat on the bed hugging his dinosaur, asking over and over, "Are we coming back?" Each time I answered the same way. "I don't know, sweetheart." It was the only honest answer I had. When we returned to the living room 20 minutes later, Veronica looked almost surprised that I had actually packed. Perhaps she expected me to beg. Perhaps she expected tears, screaming accusations. Instead, I simply picked up one bag, and Emma grabbed the other before I could stop her. Daniel stepped toward us at last. "Madeline, let's just calm down." I laughed once. It wasn't a happy sound. I've never been calmer. He reached for the handle of my wheelchair. I moved it away from him. "Don't." His shoulders dropped. "I never wanted this." "Wanting isn't enough," I replied. "You watched it happen." Emma held the front door open while Noah stayed close beside me. As I crossed the threshold, I looked back one final time. The house hadn't changed. The pictures were still on the walls. Noah's backpack still hung beside the stairs. My favorite coffee mug still sat beside the sink. Everything looked exactly the same, except it wasn't my home anymore. Outside, the afternoon air felt colder than I remembered. I called a rideshare because I didn't have the strength to ask anyone for another favor. While we waited on the curb, Emma wrapped her jacket around Noah because he was shivering. She never complained. Not once. She simply sat beside me with one hand resting quietly on my shoulder. 23 minutes later, the car arrived. The driver glanced at our bags, then at my wheelchair, but asked no questions. I appreciated that more than he could have known. We spent the first night in an inexpensive motel paid for with the emergency savings I'd kept in a separate account since before I got married. It wasn't much. Enough for a few weeks if we were careful. After putting the children to bed, I sat alone by the window watching rain slide down the glass. Every logical part of me knew I should have been terrified. I had no job anymore, no permanent home, no clear plan. But beneath all the fear was something unexpected: relief. I no longer had to wonder whether my husband would choose me. He already had. I no longer had to hope Veronica might eventually accept me. She never would. Sometimes the truth hurts less than false hope. The next morning, I called the insurance company to ask about retrieving personal belongings from my vehicle before it was disposed of. The representative placed me on hold for several minutes before returning with an answer I wasn't expecting. "Or Ms. Foster," she said carefully. "Your vehicle hasn't been released yet. It's still being held for additional documentation." I frowned. "Why? The accident happened months ago." Another pause. "I'm sorry, ma'am. That's all the information I have." After the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time. Something about her tone bothered me. It wasn't just the delay. It was the hesitation. At the time, I didn't know that one unanswered question about an old wrecked car would eventually uncover the truth that Veronica had buried so carefully. But for the first time since the accident, I felt something besides grief. I felt suspicion. The motel gave us exactly 5 days before the money I'd set aside started looking painfully small. I spent those first mornings pretending everything was temporary because my children needed certainty more than honesty. Emma helped Noah brush his teeth while I figured out how to transfer from my wheelchair to the tiny bathroom without falling. We ate cereal from paper bowls because we couldn't afford anything else, and every evening I smiled as though I had a plan. The truth was, I only had one goal each morning: make it to the next one. On the 6th day, a social worker connected us with a women's transition center called Haven House. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, safe, and full of women who understood what it meant to lose a life overnight. Some had escaped abusive marriages. Others had lost everything after illnesses or financial disasters. Nobody asked me why I was there with judgment in their eyes. They simply made room for another family trying to survive. Emma and Noah shared a small bedroom with bunk beds while I slept on a narrow hospital-style bed beside the window. For the first time since leaving Daniel's house, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for someone to criticize how I was doing it. Finding work turned out to be harder than finding shelter. My former employer had already replaced my position. Every clinic I contacted politely explained that they needed someone physically capable of demonstrating exercises throughout the day. They wished me luck. Some sounded genuinely sorry. Others barely hid their discomfort. Each rejection chipped away at my confidence until I stopped telling Emma when I had interviews because I couldn't bear watching hope disappear from her face again. One afternoon, after another rejection, I sat alone in the common room staring at my resume. It described a woman who suddenly no longer seemed to exist: years of education, certifications, experience helping patients regain independence. Yet every employer saw only the wheelchair. "Mind if I sit?" an older man asked. I looked up to see someone I didn't recognize: gray hair, worn leather briefcase, kind eyes that looked more curious than sympathetic. "Oh, of course," I answered. He introduced himself as Marcus Bennett. He volunteered at Haven House twice a month, helping residents understand insurance paperwork and disability benefits. Before retiring, he had spent nearly 30 years investigating automobile insurance claims. We talked for almost an hour. He never asked questions that made me feel pitied. Instead, he asked practical things. How long after the accident had the insurance company inspected my car? Had anyone shown me the mechanical report? Did I remember whether the brakes felt soft or completely unresponsive? When I admitted I had never seen the official report, he frowned slightly. "That's unusual," he said. "Most people request copies sooner or later." I shrugged. I trusted everything was handled properly. He nodded slowly but didn't seem convinced. Before leaving, he handed me his business card. "If you ever want another set of eyes on your file, let me know. Sometimes paperwork tells a story people miss." I thanked him politely, assuming nothing would come of it. My mind was occupied with more immediate concerns, like how to buy Noah new shoes before school started. But Marcus's questions stayed with me. 2 days later, I finally requested every document related to the accident. The insurance company emailed hundreds of pages: repair estimates, police reports, photographs, witness statements, engineering notes I barely understood. I printed everything using Haven House's office printer and spent several evenings reading until my eyes hurt. Most of it confirmed exactly what I'd already believed. Wet pavement, heavy traffic, a serious collision. Nothing unusual. Then Marcus stopped by again. I pushed the thick stack of papers across the table almost apologetically. "I don't know what I'm looking for," I admitted. He smiled. "That's my job." We spent nearly 3 hours going page by page. He explained technical language in plain English. We compared timestamps. We traced diagrams. Around sunset, Marcus suddenly stopped turning pages. He leaned closer to one report and adjusted his glasses. "That's strange," he muttered. "What is?" I asked. Instead of answering immediately, he pulled another document from the pile and placed it beside the first. "These don't match." My pulse quickened. "What doesn't?" He tapped the papers gently. "The initial roadside inspection says brake failure couldn't be ruled out, but the final summary attributes the accident entirely to driver inability to avoid the collision." I stared at him. I don't understand. Neither do I, he admitted. Normally those conclusions don't shift without additional testing. He kept reading silently for another minute before asking, did anyone ever tell you investigators examined the braking system separately? No. Did anyone ask your permission to release the vehicle? No. Marcus sat back in his chair, his expression changing from curiosity to concern. I can't tell you someone did anything wrong, but I can tell you this file isn't as straightforward as it should be. That sentence echoed in my mind for days. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to believe accidents were simply accidents. The alternative was too frightening. If something had gone wrong before the crash, then everything that followed rested on a lie. Meanwhile, life at Haven House slowly found a rhythm. Emma helped younger children with homework after school. Noah became friends with another little boy whose mother was rebuilding her life after losing her home. Watching my children adapt broke my heart and healed it at the same time. They deserved stability, yet they somehow created it wherever we landed. I started taking small online certification courses at night, hoping remote consulting might eventually become possible. Sleep became optional. Determination wasn't. About 3 weeks later, Marcus called unexpectedly. I made a few inquiries, he said. Off the record, my stomach tightened. And, your car wasn't released because an internal engineering review was opened after the accident. I gripped the phone harder. Why wasn't I told? I don't know. His voice remained calm, but I could hear something beneath it now. Unease. I'd like to visit the storage facility if they'll allow it. After all this time, sometimes evidence survives longer than people expect. A week later, we stood inside a massive warehouse filled with damaged vehicles waiting for legal clearance or disposal. My old SUV sat in the far corner, covered with dust but instantly recognizable. Seeing it felt strangely personal, as though I were visiting the body of someone I used to know. Marcus crouched near the front wheel while a mechanic unlocked the hood. They spoke quietly using terms I didn't understand. I watched their faces instead. The mechanic looked puzzled. Marcus looked increasingly serious. Nearly 20 minutes passed before he rolled himself back toward me. He didn't speak until we were outside. There are marks around the brake assembly, he said carefully. Old tool marks? What does that mean? He hesitated. It means someone worked on that system shortly before the accident. I felt the air leave my lungs. Could it have been routine maintenance? Maybe. Another pause. Or maybe not. My hands began shaking uncontrollably. Are you saying someone caused this? Marcus met my eyes. I'm saying I no longer believe this file should have been closed. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every conversation from the weeks before the crash. Veronica insisting my car should be serviced at a repair shop she recommended. Daniel mentioning his mother had already arranged the appointment because she had a discount. At the time, I'd appreciated the gesture. Now those memories refused to stay innocent. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. I needed facts, not fear. The following afternoon, Marcus called again. His voice sounded different this time, more urgent. Madeline, he said quietly, I tracked down the repair shop that serviced your vehicle 3 days before the accident. I held my breath. And? The owner passed away last year. My heart sank. Then Marcus added one more sentence. But one of his former mechanics is still alive, and according to my contact, he left that shop under very unusual circumstances. There are moments when your life changes because of something dramatic, and then there are moments when it changes because a stranger says one quiet sentence that refuses to leave your mind. Marcus's call was one of those moments. I sat on the edge of my bed at Haven House with the phone pressed tightly against my ear while Emma helped Noah with his spelling homework across the room. They were laughing about a word he kept misspelling, completely unaware that my entire understanding of the last year had just begun to crack. Do you think he'll talk to us? I asked. Marcus answered honestly. I don't know. But if he does, we listen before we assume anything. 2 days later, we drove nearly 90 minutes to a small town where the former mechanic now worked at an independent garage. His name was Raymond Ellis. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with rough hands that looked like they'd spent decades repairing engines. When Marcus introduced himself, Raymond immediately became guarded. I already answered questions years ago, he said. I don't have anything else to say. Marcus remained calm. We're not here for the insurance company. Raymond looked at me for the first time, His eyes settled on the wheelchair before returning to my face. Something changed in his expression. Not pity. Recognition. "You're the woman," he said quietly. I nodded. Was. He closed the garage door behind us before speaking again. "I always wondered what happened to you." My heartbeat became painfully loud. "What do you mean?" Raymond rubbed the back of his neck as though arguing with himself. I shouldn't have stayed quiet. He walked toward an old workbench and leaned against it. "Your stuff came into the shop 3 days before the accident. I remember because the owner told me not to touch it, said he had a special customer handling everything personally." "Ho?" I asked immediately. Raymond shook his head. "Never saw her name on the paperwork. The owner handled that himself." My disappointment must have shown because he quickly added, "But I did see something strange." Marcus didn't interrupt. He simply let Raymond continue. "The owner was working on your brake assembly after hours, alone. Nobody else was allowed in the bay." "Did he explain why?" Marcus asked. Raymond laughed bitterly. "Said it wasn't my business." Silence settled over the garage. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since Marcus first reopened my file. "Do you think he damaged my car?" Raymond took a long breath. "I think something about that repair wasn't right." The next morning, I noticed one of the brake line fittings had been removed and reinstalled. "Could that happen during normal service?" Marcus asked. "Sure." Raymond looked directly at me, but not the way I saw it. My hand started trembling again. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He lowered his eyes. "Because 3 weeks later I was fired. The owner told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted a good reference." He paused before adding, "I had 2 kids in college. I chose my family." I couldn't even be angry with him. Fear makes ordinary people compromise in ways they later regret. I understood that better than most. Before we left, Raymond reached into a drawer and pulled out a faded notebook. "I kept this after I was fired." He flipped through several pages before stopping at one dated just before my accident. "I used to write down unusual jobs in case customers came back with complaints." He pointed to a short handwritten note. "Customer requested owner only. Break, work after closing, cash payment." My pulse quickened. "Does it mention the customer's name?" Raymond shook his head. "No, but I remember one thing." Marcus leaned forward. "What?" Raymond answered slowly, choosing each word carefully. "The woman who paid was wearing an expensive pearl bracelet with a sapphire clasp. I remember because it caught the light while she counted the cash." My breath caught. Veronica owned exactly such a bracelet. I'd seen it at every Thanksgiving dinner, every birthday party, every Christmas morning since the day Daniel introduced me to his mother. But memories weren't evidence. Lots of women owned pearl bracelets. I forced myself to stay rational. On the drive back, Marcus remained unusually quiet. Finally, I asked, "You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you?" He nodded without taking his eyes off the road. "I'm thinking coincidence has limits." That night, I barely slept. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched through old family photographs stored online. Birthday parties, school events, anniversary dinners. Then I found one from Daniel's company banquet nearly 2 years earlier. Veronica stood beside him, smiling. Around her wrist rested a double-strand pearl bracelet with a sapphire clasp unlike any I'd ever seen. I stared at the picture until my eyes blurred. It still wasn't proof, but it was another piece of a puzzle that was becoming impossible to ignore. The following week brought something unexpected. Work, not a full-time position, but an email from a former patient whose daughter owned a small rehabilitation consulting company. She remembered how I had helped her father recover after a stroke years earlier. "Would you be interested in remote patient coaching?" she asked during our video call. "You wouldn't need to leave home." I accepted before she finished the sentence. The pay wasn't remarkable, but it was enough to remind me I still had value beyond my wheelchair. Every evening after the children went to bed, I coached patients online, reviewed therapy plans, and slowly rebuilt the confidence that Veronica had tried so hard to erase. Emma noticed first. "You're smiling again," she said one night while washing dishes beside me. I looked at her and realized she was right, not because life had become easier, because for the first time in months, my future depended more on my choices than on someone else's cruelty. A month later, the consulting work had grown enough that I registered a small remote rehabilitation support business under my own name. It wasn't much, just me, a laptop, and determination. But it was mine. While my business slowly expanded, Marcus continued investigating. Every few days he called with another small discovery. Most turned out to be dead ends. Incomplete maintenance logs. Employees who had moved away. We celebrated tiny victories because they were all we had. Then one rainy Thursday afternoon, Olivia Chen entered my life. Marcus insisted I needed an attorney before pushing any further. Olivia specialized in civil fraud and insurance litigation. She listened without interrupting while I told my story from beginning to end. When I finished, she closed her notebook and asked only one question. Madeline, what do you want? I thought about it for several seconds. Finally, I answered, I don't want revenge. She raised an eyebrow. No, I shook my head. I want the truth, whatever it is. Olivia smiled faintly. Good. Why? Because juries trust people looking for truth much more than people looking for revenge. Before leaving her office, she handed me a list of documents she wanted collected. Financial records, insurance correspondence, vehicle maintenance history, family communications if available. It looked overwhelming. Then she pointed to one item near the bottom. Bank records connected to the repair shop during the month before the accident. I frowned. Can we even get those? Olivia answered calmly. Not yet. Then why put them on the list? She gathered her files into a neat stack. Because if someone paid to make your accident happen. She looked directly into my eyes. Money almost always remembers what people try to forget. If someone had told me a year earlier that rebuilding my career would become easier than rebuilding my trust, I would have laughed. Yet that was exactly what happened. My business kept growing one patient at a time, while every new piece of evidence made me question whether any part of my old life had been real. During the day, I coached stroke survivors, accident victims, and elderly clients through exercises that helped them reclaim small pieces of independence. At night, Marcus and Olivia helped me piece together a very different kind of rehabilitation. The reconstruction of the truth. By the beginning of the second year after leaving Daniel, my remote consulting business had expanded beyond anything I had imagined. Former patients referred new ones. Physical therapy clinics contracted me to provide virtual follow-up care. I hired another therapist on a part-time basis because I could no longer manage every client myself. Haven House had given us safety, but now I was finally earning enough to rent a modest two-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't large, and the elevator broke at least once a month, but every bill was paid with money I had earned myself. Emma chose pale blue curtains for her room. No insisted on painting a wooden sign that read, "Home," and hanging it by the front door. It was crooked. I never fixed it. Every time I looked at it, I remembered that this home had been built without anyone's permission. Daniel never called. Not once. Child support arrived through automatic court payments, exactly on schedule. Always without a note. At first I resented how easily money had replaced fatherhood. Eventually I stopped expecting anything else. The children still visited him every other weekend, according to the custody agreement. I never spoke badly about him before they left, and I never questioned them when they returned. They deserved the freedom to build their own opinions. Even so, I noticed small changes. Emma talked less after visiting her father's house. No stopped mentioning Grandma Veronica altogether. I didn't push. Children reveal the truth in their own time. One Friday afternoon, Emma came home carrying a sketchbook, while Noah watched cartoons in the living room. She quietly sat beside me at the kitchen table. "Mom," she asked, "can I tell you something?" Always. She hesitated before opening the sketchbook. Inside was a drawing of our old house. Veronica stood in one upstairs window. Daniel stood near the front door. Emma had drawn me and Noah outside in the rain. "Grandma said something last weekend?" she whispered. What did she say? Emma stared at the drawing instead of me. She told Dad that if the accident hadn't happened, none of this would have worked. My entire body went still. "Did your father answer?" Emma nodded slowly. Looked confused. He asked what she meant. "Hand," she said. "Never mind, forget I said anything." Emma looked up at me. Worried? Why would she say that? I forced myself to stay calm. "I don't know yet." That last word mattered. Yet, I wrote down Emma's exact memory as soon as she went to bed. Olivia had warned me never to rely on vague recollections. Details mattered. Dates mattered. Exact wording mattered. The next morning, I emailed everything to her. She called within an hour. "Children's memories alone won't prove anything," she said carefully. But if Veronica slipped once, she may have slipped before. That possibility changed our strategy. Instead of looking only at financial records, Olivia began searching for communication records connected to the repair shop owner. It took weeks. Legal requests moved slowly. Every delay tested my patience. During that time, my business reached another milestone. We signed a partnership with 2 rehabilitation clinics, allowing patients recovering at home to schedule virtual coaching sessions through my company. I officially registered the business under a new name, Forward Again Recovery Services. The name wasn't just marketing. It described exactly what I had been trying to do with my own life. On the morning we signed the contracts, I stood with my cane instead of sitting in my wheelchair for the photographs. I still couldn't walk far without support, but every year brought progress. My therapist smiled proudly. "Remember 12 seconds?" she asked. I laughed. "No, I complain if I can't stand for 12 minutes. Some victories are too quiet for anyone outside your life to notice." Those were the ones I treasured most. Then Marcus called with the kind of voice I'd learned to recognize, calm on the surface. I found someone else. Who? The repair shop owner's bookkeeper. I nearly dropped my phone. "She's willing to talk. She refused for years. But the owner's estate is being audited, and she doesn't want to carry secrets anymore." 2 days later, Olivia, Marcus, and I met the woman at a small law office. Her name was Linda Carver. She looked exhausted before anyone asked a question. "I'm not proud of this," she said immediately. "I should have spoken sooner," Olivia gently replied. "Just tell us what you remember." Linda took a deep breath. The owner occasionally accepted cash jobs he never entered into the regular system. My pulse quickened. Was my vehicle one of them? Linda closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "Yes." The room became completely silent. "Who paid?" Olivia asked. Linda shook her head. "Never met her." "But—" She reached into her purse and removed a worn ledger. "I copied unusual transactions because I didn't trust my boss." She opened it carefully and pointed to an entry dated 3 days before my accident. "Cash deposit. What did thou? Customer requested no invoice, no name, just an amount." Olivia photographed every page while Marcus studied the handwriting. "Can this be authenticated?" he asked. "Yes," Linda answered. I kept the original bank deposit slips too. She slid another envelope across the table. Inside were copies of deposits made the same afternoon. My hands trembled as I held them. $8,000. Paid in cash. 3 days before my brakes failed. It wasn't enough to identify Veronica directly, but it proved someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide a payment. As we left the office, Olivia turned toward me. "We're getting close." "Close to what?" I asked. "To the point where someone starts making mistakes." She was right, because secrets become heavier the longer they're carried, and people carrying heavy secrets eventually slip. 3 nights later, Daniel called me for the first time in nearly 2 years. His voice sounded strained. "Mom's been acting strangely," he admitted without greeting me. I said nothing. He continued. "She keeps asking if anyone's contacted me about the accident." My heartbeat accelerated. "Why would she ask that?" "I don't know." He paused. "Honestly, she's terrified of something." I leaned back in my chair, forcing myself to breathe evenly. "Daniel," I asked quietly, "has your mother ever mentioned the repair shop where my sub was serviced?" There was a long silence. Then he answered with words I never expected to hear. "Actually," another pause. "She told me years ago never to take any of our cars there again because—" His voice trailed off. "'Cause what?" I whispered. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Because she said the owner knew too much." My fingers tightened around the phone. Somewhere buried beneath years of lies, Veronica had finally begun losing control of the story she had spent so long protecting. And I had the feeling she knew it. I didn't sleep after Daniel's phone call. Every sentence he had spoken kept replaying in my head, especially the last one. She said the owner knew too much. Those 6 words carried more weight than any document we had uncovered so far because they came from Veronica herself. She had never imagined Daniel would repeat them to me years later. Secrets have a strange way of surviving in the memories of people who don't even realize they're important. I called Olivia before sunrise. She answered on the second ring. "You were awake too?" I asked. She gave a tired laugh. "Cases like this don't let lawyers sleep." I repeated Daniel's exact words. When I finished, there was silence for several seconds. Finally, she said, "Don't contact Veronica. Don't confront Daniel." We let the evidence move before the emotions do. That had become her rule from the beginning. Facts first, reactions later. It wasn't always easy to follow, but she had been right every single time. 2 weeks later, Another breakthrough arrived. Linda, the former bookkeeper, called Marcus after cleaning out several boxes from her attic. She had found an old external hard drive that once belonged to the repair shop's accounting computer. Most of the files were damaged, but one folder contained scanned receipts and internal notes the owner had apparently kept for himself. Olivia arranged for a forensic specialist to recover the data. Watching the progress bar crawl across the screen felt almost unbearable. At last, one document opened successfully. It wasn't an invoice, it was a handwritten instruction scanned into the system. Customer requests break adjustment, no paperwork. Cash only. Owner handling personally. Still no name. But attached to the file was something none of us expected. A blurry security camera image captured automatically at the shop entrance. The quality was poor. The woman's face couldn't be identified, but she was wearing a long beige coat and carrying an unmistakable leather handbag with a silver horse emblem. My heart skipped. Veronica had carried that same designer bag for years. I remembered buying leather conditioner for it one Christmas because she insisted nobody else knew how to care for expensive handbags properly. Even then, Olivia stayed cautious. Recognition isn't proof, she reminded us. We need something objective. Fortunately, the image included something else. The vehicle's license plate. Marcus enlarged the picture until the numbers became readable. He immediately ran a registration search through legal channels. The car belonged to Veronica Hale. Nobody spoke for several seconds. It wasn't enough to prove she ordered anyone to sabotage my brakes, but it proved she had personally visited the repair shop days before my accident, after insisting Daniel let her arrange the vehicle service. The walls around her story were beginning to crack, while investigators continued reviewing the evidence. Life refused to pause. Forward Again Recovery Services kept growing faster than I had anticipated. We moved into a small office with 2 treatment rooms for virtual consultations and adaptive equipment demonstrations. I hired 3 therapists and 1 administrative assistant, all women who had rebuilt their own careers after life unexpectedly changed. Every time I interviewed someone, I looked for resilience instead of perfection. Experience had taught me those were rarely the same thing. Emma, now almost 12, loved spending afternoons in the office after school. She organized therapy bands by color and insisted she was assistant manager. No preferred helping our maintenance technician tighten loose screws or assemble furniture. Watching them laugh inside a business built from what everyone once called my greatest weakness filled me with a quiet gratitude I couldn't describe. One afternoon, while I was reviewing patient schedules, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Foster, a man's voice asked. "This is Detective Aaron Mills." My stomach tightened instantly. "Yes?" "We've reopened the investigation surrounding your accident." I closed my office door before replying. "Because of the evidence?" "Among other things?" He paused. "Would like you to come in tomorrow." The interview lasted nearly 4 hours. Detectives asked me to repeat every detail from the week before the crash. Who arranged the maintenance appointment? Who had access to my vehicle? Who benefited if my marriage ended? They never suggested answers. They simply listened. Near the end, Detective Mills placed a photograph on the table. It showed the security camera image from the repair shop. "Can you identify the woman?" he asked. I studied it carefully before answering. "I believe it's my mother-in-law, based on the vehicle, the handbag, the bracelet she always wore." He nodded without revealing anything. "Thank you." As I prepared to leave, he said one more thing. "Mrs. Foster, people who plan one lie usually create 10 others trying to protect it." That sentence stayed with me all week. Daniel called again 3 days later. This time he sounded frightened instead of confused. "The police came to Mom's house." I remained silent. "She told me they're harassing her because of you. Do you believe that?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. Then he whispered something I never expected to hear. "I don't know what to believe anymore." There was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. For the first time since our marriage fell apart, I heard a man questioning the foundation of everything his mother had taught him. I said gently, "I'm not asking you to choose me." He breathed slowly into the phone. "Then what are you asking?" "Choose the truth." He didn't reply, but he didn't hang up either. A week later, Detective Mills called again. "We've interviewed the mechanic, Raymond." "Yes." "Did he tell you everything?" "Almost." My pulse quickened. "Almost?" He remembered something after our interview. I gripped the edge of my desk. What? The detective spoke carefully. He remembered that the woman paying cash argued with the shop owner because she wanted the problem to appear accidental, not fatal. My entire body went cold. I couldn't speak. Detective Mills continued quietly, Mrs. Foster, this investigation is no longer focused solely on vehicle tampering. I finally found my voice. What does that mean? It means we're now investigating intent. After the call ended, I sat alone in my office long after everyone else had gone home. For years, I had wondered why my marriage collapsed so quickly after the accident. Now I understood something far more terrifying. The accident hadn't destroyed my family. Someone had tried to create the perfect circumstances for my family to fall apart. And if Detective Mills was right, Veronica hadn't simply wanted me injured. She had wanted my entire life rewritten. When people imagine justice, they usually picture a dramatic courtroom confession or a single moment when everything changes. Real life isn't like that. Justice moves slowly. It asks for patience when all you want is closure. It makes you relive the worst days of your life over and over until the truth is strong enough to stand on its own. By the time Detective Mills called me back, nearly 3 years had passed since the afternoon Veronica had smiled across my living room and called me a disgrace. I had learned that healing and waiting often looked exactly the same from the outside. The investigation became part of my daily life without ever becoming my whole life. Every few weeks, Olivia updated me on subpoenas, forensic reports, and interviews. Every few weeks, I reminded myself that my real job was still being Emma and Noah's mother. My children had already lost enough because of one person's choices. I refused to let them lose me to bitterness too. Forward Again Recovery Services had become more than a business by then. We had moved into a larger building with fully accessible treatment spaces, adaptive exercise equipment, and a small classroom where we taught families how to support loved ones recovering from serious injuries. Many of our clients weren't just rebuilding their bodies, they were rebuilding marriages, careers, confidence, and hope. Every time someone walked through our doors believing their life was over, I saw a little of myself from years earlier. And every time one of them took a first independent step or returned to work after months of recovery, I quietly celebrated with them because I knew victories like that could never be measured only by distance or money. One Thursday afternoon, while I was finishing a consultation, Olivia arrived without calling first. She almost never did that. The expression on her face told me something significant had happened. After my last client left, she closed my office door and placed a thick folder on my desk. "It's over," she said softly. I looked at her without understanding. "What is? The investigation?" My heart skipped. "Did they close it?" She slowly shook her head. "No." She opened the folder and slid several documents toward me. "They've decided to file charges." For a moment I couldn't breathe. After years of uncertainty, the words didn't feel real. Olivia continued carefully. Detectives recovered deleted financial records linking Veronica directly to the cash withdrawal used before your vehicle was serviced. Combined with the mechanic's testimony, the surveillance image, and additional forensic analysis of the brake system, the district attorney believes there's enough evidence to move forward. I lowered my eyes to the papers. Veronica's name appeared over and over again. Seeing it there didn't make me feel victorious. It made me feel tired. Deeply, profoundly tired. Olivia seemed to understand. She quietly said, "You don't have to read everything today." I nodded but kept turning pages anyway. Then I reached one paragraph that stopped me completely. During questioning, Veronica had admitted arranging the repair appointment herself. She insisted she only wanted minor mechanical issues, so Daniel would realize how difficult life with me had become after the accident. She denied intending serious harm. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Not because I believed her explanation, but because someone had actually planned to interfere with my life, as though my future were theirs to redesign. She had treated my marriage like a business transaction, my body like an obstacle, my children like collateral damage. 2 weeks later, Daniel asked if we could meet. We chose a quiet coffee shop halfway between our homes. Emma and Noah were at school. It was the first time we had spoken face to face in almost 3 years. He looked older than I remembered, not because of gray hair or wrinkles, because regret has a way of changing the way people carry themselves. He stood when I entered, instinctively reaching for my chair before remembering I now walked short distances with a cane. "You don't need to do that anymore," I said gently. He nodded awkwardly. We sat in silence for almost a minute before he finally spoke. I testified. I already knew. Olivia had told me. Still, hearing it from him mattered. I told him everything, he continued. About Mom arranging your vehicle service, about what she said after the accident, about everything I ignored. He swallowed hard. I should have listened to you. I looked at the man I had once imagined growing old beside. No, I answered quietly. You should have listened to yourself. Tears filled his eyes immediately. I don't expect forgiveness. Good, I replied honestly. Because that's not why we're here? He nodded. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what my silence cost. We talked for almost an hour. Not about getting back together. That possibility had disappeared long before. Instead, we talked about Emma's dream of studying architecture, about Noah's obsession with robotics, about co-parenting, about responsibility. Before leaving, Daniel asked one final question. Is there anything I can ever do to make this right? I thought carefully before answering. Be the father they deserved from the beginning. He cried openly then. It was the first time I had ever seen him allow himself to. Veronica's legal case concluded several months later. She accepted a negotiated resolution rather than forcing everyone through a lengthy public trial. Part of that agreement required a formal admission that her actions contributed to the chain of events leading to my accident and years of investigation. She also lost much of the reputation she had spent decades building. Friends distanced themselves. Community organizations quietly removed her from leadership positions. None of that brought me joy. Karma rarely feels exciting when you've already healed without it. The biggest surprise came from Emma. After reading a carefully edited summary of the case prepared with her therapist, she asked if she could write her grandmother a letter. I worried at first, but her therapist encouraged it. Emma spent 2 days writing before sealing the envelope herself. She later showed me a copy. The final sentence stayed with me forever. You didn't break my mom. You only showed me who deserved to be called family. I cried harder reading those words than I had after any courtroom document, because they proved something Veronica had never understood. Love isn't inherited, it's earned. A month later, we held a small open house celebrating the expansion of Forward Again recovery services. Former patients returned walking beside spouses who had once carried them. Children laughed in the waiting room. Staff members shared stories about impossible recoveries that somehow became possible. As everyone gathered for a group photograph, Noah wrapped one arm around my waist while Emma stood proudly beside me. Smile, Mom, she whispered. I looked around the room filled with people who had chosen compassion over control, truth over comfort, hope over fear. Then I smiled. Not because justice had finally arrived, but because I had already built a life strong enough that justice was no longer the thing keeping me standing. People often ask whether forgiveness brings peace. I don't know if that's always true. What I do know is that clarity does. Once the investigation ended and Veronica's case was no longer hanging over our lives, I realized I wasn't waking up every morning wondering why everything had happened. I already knew why. The harder question became what I wanted the rest of my life to look like now that the answers had finally arrived. That question turned out to matter much more than revenge ever had. Daniel kept the promise he made in the coffee shop. He started showing up consistently for Emma and Noah, not with expensive gifts or dramatic speeches, but with ordinary things that should have happened years earlier. He attended parent-teacher conferences. He drove Noah to robotics competitions. He sat through Emma's weekend architecture workshops without checking his phone every 5 minutes. The children noticed the difference long before I did. One evening, Noah came home carrying a small model bridge he had built with Daniel. Dad actually stayed the whole time, he said with a smile that carried both excitement and caution. He didn't leave early. I smiled back. I'm glad you had fun. That was all I said. I had learned not to place my feelings between my children and the relationship they were trying to rebuild with their father. Whatever Daniel and I had lost belonged to us. Their chance to know him belonged to them. Emma remained more guarded. She forgave slowly, thoughtfully, and only after people consistently earned it. One afternoon, while helping me organize files at the office, she quietly asked, "Do you think Grandma ever loved us?" The question caught me completely off guard. I looked at my daughter for a long moment before answering. I think she loved the version of life she wanted more than the people who didn't fit into it. Emma considered that carefully. That's sad. Yes, I replied. For her more than anyone else. Emma nodded once and returned to sorting paperwork. That was enough. She no longer needed perfect answers. She only needed honest ones. My own life continued moving forward in ways I never would have imagined during those first terrifying nights at Haven House. Forward again, recovery services now employed 11 people. Several of them had once been patients themselves. We launched scholarship programs for families who couldn't afford adaptive equipment. We partnered with hospitals across the state to provide long-term recovery coaching after discharge. Every new project reminded me why I had survived everything that came before. If my career before the accident had been about helping individuals recover, my work now was about changing entire systems that often forgot what recovery actually looked like. Karen, my old physical therapist, attended our annual community fundraiser that spring. After everyone else left, she walked beside me through the empty therapy room. I no longer needed my wheelchair except on days when long distances aggravated my back. Most of the time I used only a lightweight cane. Karen smiled as she watched me cross the room. Do you remember crying because you could only stand for 12 seconds? I laughed. I remember thinking my life was over. She shook her head. No, your old life ended. That's different. Those words stayed with me long after she left. My old life had ended. But ending isn't always the same as failing. Sometimes it's simply making room for something stronger. About 6 months after Veronica's legal case concluded, I received an invitation to speak at a regional conference for rehabilitation specialists, patients, and families rebuilding after catastrophic injuries. The organizers wanted me to talk about resilience and entrepreneurship. At first, I almost declined. Public speaking had never appealed to me. Then Emma looked over the invitation and said, "Mom, if someone like you had talked to us when we were at Haven House, maybe I would have been less scared." That settled it. The conference hall held nearly 400 people. Some sat in wheelchairs. Others used prosthetic limbs, walkers, or service dogs. Family members filled the remaining seats. As I stood backstage waiting to be introduced, my hands trembled exactly the way they had before every difficult physical therapy milestone years earlier. Emma squeezed my hand. Noah straightened my jacket proudly. "Go show them," he whispered. When I stepped onto the stage, applause filled the room. I looked across hundreds of faces and realized many of them weren't looking at my cane. They were looking for hope. I began with the truth. 3 years ago, I said, I believed the hardest part of losing the ability to walk was learning how to move again. I was wrong. The room became completely silent. The hardest part was discovering which people walked away from me. No one interrupted. No one needed to. I spoke for nearly 40 minutes about rebuilding confidence, accepting help without surrendering dignity, and refusing to let other people's opinions define the limits of our future. I never mentioned Veronica by name. I never described the investigation in detail. That wasn't the story people needed. They needed to know recovery was possible, even when betrayal came from the people closest to them. Afterward, dozens of attendees waited to speak with me. A young man recovering from a motorcycle accident thanked me for giving him hope. A mother whose teenage daughter had recently suffered a spinal injury hugged me without saying a word. An older veteran simply shook my hand and whispered, "Needed that." As the crowd slowly dispersed, I noticed Daniel standing quietly near the back of the auditorium. He hadn't told me he planned to come. He waited until everyone else finished before walking over. "You were incredible," he said softly. I smiled politely. "Thank you." He looked around at the families still talking in small groups. "You helped more people today than I probably will in my entire career." I shook my head. "You can still help 2 people every day." He understood immediately. "Emma, and no," he nodded. "I won't waste that chance again." I believed him, not because of his words, but because of the man his actions had slowly become over the past year. We walked outside together where Emma and Noah were waiting. They naturally stood between us instead of feeling forced to choose sides. Looking at them, I realized something remarkable had happened. The greatest victory wasn't proving Veronica's guilt. It wasn't building a successful business. It wasn't even learning to walk again. The greatest victory was that my children no longer carried the weight of our past on their shoulders. They were simply kids again. And after everything we'd lived through, that felt like the most extraordinary miracle of all. A year after the conference, I stood in the kitchen of the house I had dreamed about during those long nights at Haven House. Morning sunlight spilled across hardwood floors that belonged to no one but us. Emma was now preparing college applications, covering the dining table with sketches of sustainable buildings she hoped to design someday. Noah had transformed the garage into a miniature robotics workshop, where wires, tiny motors, and half-finished inventions seemed to multiply overnight. Sometimes I simply stood in the doorway and watched them, overwhelmed by how ordinary our lives had finally become. Ordinary had once sounded boring. Now it felt like the greatest luxury I had ever known. My cane leaned against the counter. Forgotten more often than not, I still used it when my back stiffened after long days, but there were mornings when I crossed the entire kitchen before realizing I had left it behind. My therapist once told me recovery wasn't about becoming the person you were before. It was about discovering the person you could become afterward. Looking around my home, I finally understood what she meant. I no longer measured my life by what the accident had taken. I measured it by everything I had built despite it. Forward Again Recovery Services had grown into something far beyond my original dream. We now partnered with hospitals in several neighboring counties and offered scholarships for families who couldn't afford long-term rehabilitation. Every quarter, we hosted free workshops where former patients shared their stories with people just beginning their own recovery journeys. I always sat quietly in the back during those sessions. Hearing someone say, "I thought my life was over until I met people who proved it wasn't," reminded me why every difficult step had mattered. One afternoon, while organizing old files in my office, I found the very first notebook I had used at Haven House. Inside were pages filled with tiny goals written during the darkest weeks of my life. Find any job. Buy Emma new shoes. Make no smile today. Walk 10 seconds. I traced my fingers over the faded handwriting and realized none of those goals had been about success. They had simply been about surviving. Survival eventually became stability. Stability became confidence. Confidence became purpose. It happened so slowly that I almost missed the transformation while living through it. Daniel continued being present for the children. Our relationship settled into something neither of us had expected: respect without romance, cooperation without pretending the past had never happened. We attended Emma's high school graduation together, sitting on opposite ends of the same row. When her name was called, we both stood and applauded with tears in our eyes. After the ceremony, Emma wrapped her arms around both of us at once. "Thank you," she whispered. I knew she wasn't thanking us for being perfect parents. She was thanking us for finally putting her future ahead of our history. Nah, never one to stay emotional for long, interrupted by announcing he had already been accepted into an advanced robotics program for the summer. We laughed, and just like that, life moved forward again. I heard occasional updates about Veronica through mutual acquaintances, though I never sought them out. She had sold the large house she once guarded so fiercely and moved into a quiet retirement community. Few people visited her. Daniel checked on her from time to time because she was still his mother, but even he admitted their relationship would never be what it had been. The hardest consequence she faced wasn't financial or legal. It was living with the knowledge that every family gathering she had once controlled now happened without her. She had spent years trying to decide who belonged in the family, only to discover that love cannot be managed like a business. I didn't celebrate that outcome, I simply accepted it. Karma rarely arrives as thunder. More often, it arrives as loneliness created by your own choices. One autumn evening, Emma found me sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. She handed me a mug of tea before taking the chair beside mine. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She looked toward the yard where Noah was teaching the neighbor's little boy how to fly a homemade drone. "If you could go back and change everything, would you?" I didn't answer immediately. It was the kind of question that deserved honesty instead of convenience. Finally, I said, "If changing everything meant keeping the accident from happening, part of me would want that." She nodded quietly. "But," I smiled, "but then I wouldn't have this life. I wouldn't have this company. I wouldn't have met the people who taught me how strong I really was. And I don't know if you and Noah would have become the people you are today." Emma leaned her head against my shoulder just as she had when she was a little girl. "I'm glad you're my mom," she whispered. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. "I'm the lucky one," I replied. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked through the quiet house one last time before turning off the lights. I paused beside the crooked wooden sign Noah had painted years earlier. Home. We had kept it through every move because none of us wanted a straighter, prettier replacement. It reminded us where we had started and how far we had come. I touched the edge of the worn wood and smiled. Veronica once believed a wheelchair made me weak. Daniel once believed silence would keep the peace. I had believed that earning acceptance from the wrong people would eventually make me enough. All three of us had been wrong. The wheelchair never defined my future. Their betrayal never defined my worth. And the life I built afterward proved something I wish every person facing impossible circumstances could believe before it's too late. The people who try hardest to convince you that you're broken are often the ones most afraid of seeing what you're capable of becoming without them. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this: never let someone else's opinion become the foundation of your identity. People can take your job, your house, your reputation, even your ability to walk. But they cannot take your determination unless you hand it to them yourself. I lost a marriage, a home, and the family I thought would stand beside me forever. In return, I found the courage to build a life no one could ever take away again. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't watching the people who hurt you lose everything. It's waking up one ordinary morning and realizing they no longer have the power to occupy your heart. So let me ask you this. If the people who were supposed to love you only valued you when your life was easy, were they ever truly your family to begin with? People sometimes assume that the happiest day of my life was the day the investigation ended or the day Veronica finally faced the consequences of her choices. It wasn't. Those days brought closure, but not happiness. The happiest day came much later, on an ordinary Saturday morning when Emma was home from college for the weekend and Noah was trying to convince me that his newest invention, a robot designed to water houseplants, would someday make him a millionaire. The three of us ended up laughing so hard in the kitchen that we burned the pancakes. Nobody cared. We ordered takeout instead and spent the rest of the morning teasing each other over who had ruined breakfast. Somewhere in the middle of all that laughter, I realized something that caught me completely by surprise. For nearly an hour, I hadn't thought about Veronica. I hadn't thought about Daniel. I hadn't thought about the accident, the courtroom, or the years I spent wondering why my life had fallen apart. I was simply living. That was the moment I truly understood what healing looked like. It wasn't forgetting the past. It was no longer letting the past interrupt the present. A few months later, Forward Again Recovery Services celebrated its 5th anniversary. We invited former patients, staff members, volunteers, and families who had become part of our journey. As I stood near the entrance greeting guests, I noticed a young woman slowly making her way toward me with the help of a walker. She smiled nervously before saying, "3 years ago, I watched one of your videos while I was in a hospital bed. I thought my life was over. Today I walked in here by myself because you convinced me not to quit." I hugged her before I could stop the tears. In that moment, I realized my story had stopped belonging only to me. It had become proof that even after betrayal, loss, and unimaginable disappointment, a life could still be rebuilt into something beautiful that was worth more than any verdict a courtroom could ever deliver. Every now and then, Emma jokes that I should finally throw away the old wheelchair stored in the garage. I always smile and tell her, "Not yet. It isn't there because I'm waiting to need it again. It's there because it reminds me how far we've come." It's a reminder that strength doesn't always look like standing. Sometimes it looks like refusing to stop moving forward, even when life forces you to do it differently than you planned. If you've stayed with me through this story, I hope you'll remember one thing: the people who truly love you won't measure your worth by what you've lost. They'll remind you of what still remains. And if someone walks away the moment your life becomes difficult, believe them the first time. They're showing you who they are. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you have chosen forgiveness or would you have walked away forever?